Hello, Orange Room friends. It's Anne. Let's sing our hello song. 1, 2, 3. Hello, 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 and how are you? I'm fine, and I hope that you are too. Hola, 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 y cómo estás? Muy bien. Muy bien. Y espero que tú también. So, Orange Room friends, I've been looking at your pictures, and I thought maybe today we would take the time to say hello to each and every one of you. So, in our morning class, hello, Juliana. Hello, Nora. Hello, Cece, Santiago, and Ilan. Hello, Bella. Hello, Jet and Seamus. Hello, William and Mariana. Hello, Nick and Maya. Hello, Emily. Hello, Kareem. Hello, Clara and Jasper. Hello, morning, Orange Room. And now let's do our afternoon class. Hello, Madison. Hello, Vicky and Caitlin. Hello, Maeve and Ari. Hello, Ben and Ariane. Hello, Henry and Olivia. Hello, Eva and Desmond. Hello, Sadie and Iman. Hello, Micah and Lucy. And hello to Michelle and Raina and Maria and Linda. Okay, now let's do our calendar. We have a very different looking calendar today. Take a look. Remember last time when you saw Michelle, the whole calendar of March was filled with numbers. But now it's a new month called April. And so we have our first number to put into April. But it doesn't start with the first day of the week. It starts with Wacky Wednesday because yesterday was Tuesday. So let's put our first picture up. What is it? It's a purple umbrella. I wonder what our pattern's going to be this month. And why is it an umbrella? Well, have you ever heard anyone say, April showers bring May flowers? That's because it rains a lot in April. So our first picture is an umbrella, but I don't know what it's going to be tomorrow. We'll find out. Okay, so speaking of raining, last week, it was actually the end of March. It was a few days ago. I took a walk with my dog Winnie, and it felt, well, first of all, it looked cloudy, and it looked a little rainy. It wasn't really raining hard, but it was sprinkling, and it felt cold. I was all bundled up with my hat and gloves and a warm coat, and it felt wet. And even though it's springtime, it felt a little wintry. But you know what? Even though it felt a little wintry out, I saw some signs of spring and I took some pictures. First, I saw this on the ground. Do you know what that is? I think we talked about this bird when winter was coming, and we talked about this bird flying south to where it was warmer. This is a robin, and now the robins are back. And I saw so many robins on my walk with the dog. I especially saw them hopping around on the ground because it had recently rained. Was raining a little bit, and they were looking for worms because the worms often come up when it's right after a rain or when it's raining very lightly. So if you get a chance to go outside or even just look out your window, see if you can notice any robins. You might see them in a tree, or you might see them hopping around on the ground looking for worms. And then I took some other pictures. It was so exciting. I heard all this noise and I was getting near the pond at Lovelace Park. And then when I got closer, look what I saw. That's a female duck, a mallard duck. And then I saw the male. That's the male. It's the male. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but the male has some like sort of a very pretty greenish color on its head. And then I saw the two ducks swimming about the pond. And you know what I think they were doing? I think they were looking for a home or a nest, a good place to build their nest. So those are signs of spring. And you know what? It was so cold out. And I thought, even though maybe those ducks don't feel the cold as much as me, that water must be pretty freezing cold. So I came home and I looked up some information about ducks. And I found out that they have this special gland by their tail feather that releases oil. And the duck will stick its beak in the oil and spread it all around its feathers so that the water sort of rolls off of it. It's kind of waterproofing itself. So I thought it would be fun to maybe see how that might work. So I'm going to grab a tray and I'm going to try something here. So let me put this down like this now. I have two pictures of ducks, 1, 2, and I've got this is vegetable oil. I bet most of you have some of this in your house for cooking. And I have a paintbrush and I put a little bit of that oil in this bowl. And first I'm going to take some watercolor paint. This is called liquid watercolor. And I'm going to put a little drop. If I get an eyedropper, I'd use an eyedropper, but I don't have one of those at home. So I'm just going to drop a little bit on there. I'm going to see what happens. So it's kind of absorbing into the paper. See that? So if this blue watercolor paint was water in the pond, it might soak into the duck's feathers. And it might make the duck feel kind of not as comfortable and heavy and cold with water. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my other duck picture and I'm going to take some of my oil in this bowl, and I'm going to paint my duck with the oil. I'm going to see if I can waterproof this picture of this duck. I'm not sure if this will work, but it's fun to try. So I'm going to paint all over my duck. And then I'm going to see what happens when I put my watercolor paint on it. Okay, here goes. Let's see what happens. Oh my, can you see this? Instead of soaking into the water, it's forming drops and they're kind of rolling off the duck. They rolled right off. That's what happens when the duck uses the oil from its preening gland and it spreads the oil around its feathers with his beak. You might notice, if you see a duck at a duck pond, you might notice it doing that. You know what it kind of reminded me of? Do you remember when we made those hearts? When we had the oily paint that we dropped on the water, and then we put the paper in, and the oil didn't mix with the water, so instead of getting a solid blue, we got little dots. So I thought, since we have the oil out, maybe we could do that. So I've got, you know what? I'm going to actually put this on a tray. So I've got a tray here. because this could be a tiny bit messy. So I've got a cookie sheet here that I'm using, and I've got some newspaper. So let's see here. Let's show you what I got here. Okay, and I'm not going to use watercolor paint because the watercolor paint that I had has a lot of water in it, and we know that water doesn't mix with oil, right? So last time when we did it at school, I had powder paint, but I don't have any powder paint. So I'm going to use this, it's called tempera paint. It's a little thicker, and it's not as watery as watercolor. And I put a little bit in. Boop, boop. And I'm putting some oil in. Let me get my oil. This was my oil that I used before. Put some oil, and I'm going to stir, stir. Let's see if you can see this. Okay. So I'm stirring. It doesn't mix quite as well as the powder paint did, but it's still kind of making an orange oil. And that orange happens to be the color that I had at home. I don't know if you have some of this paint at home, but if you do, you could maybe try this with a grown-up. And that other thing where we drop the watercolor paint, you could, if you have watercolor paints that you dip your brush in water and use, you could see if that works too. You could try putting some oil on a paper and see if it soaks in or if it rolls off. Okay, so meanwhile, I'm going to try this. So I've got my oil and my paint mixed up as best I could. And I've got some water in this pan right here. See the water? And I'm going to drop some paint. Boop. Okay. Okay, so now let me show you. You see how it's kind of floating on top like it did when we made those hearts? So now I'm going to take a duck. I just have a paper duck I cut out. And I'm going to set it in there. And remember how we did with the hearts? We kind of let it sit there for just a little bit. Meanwhile, I'm going to see what happens if I put oil on my other paper duck here. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to paint this duck with oil while I'm letting the other one sit for a minute. I want to see if I get the same result or a different result. This is called, I'm experimenting, and I haven't tried this. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I have an idea that maybe it won't absorb the paint as well because it's got oil on it, but we'll find out. Okay, so let's see how our duck looks. Whoop. I got an orange spotted duck, and I'll set this here on the newspaper to dry. So I've got a tray and I've got newspaper so we don't make too much of a mess. Now let me add a little bit more paint, a little bit more in there. My oil and paint mixture. Okay. And then I'm going to see what happens if I put this oily duck in there. I don't know. There is oil in the paint, so we'll see if it sticks because oil and oil mix, just oil and water don't mix. I'm not really sure what's going to happen. I just thought I'd see. Let's give it just another second here. Meanwhile, I wanted to show you one more thing. So have you been washing your hands a lot at home? I know we do a lot when we're in the orange room. So I have a little bit of oil in this bowl still. And I'm going to do something kind of funny. I'm going to put it on my hands. And I'm going to rub it. And I'm going to be careful not to touch anything around me other than I'm going to go over to the sink. And so my hands are all oily. Now, I'm going to try with my elbow, because I don't want to touch this, I'm going to try to turn our camera. So careful. Okay, so you can kind of see the sink. And I'm going to come over to the sink. And I'm going to, can you see me? Let's see, I'm just on the edges here. I'll touch very lightly. Okay, now there's my paper towels. Here's my faucet. And I'm just going to put some water on my hands. So I rubbed my hands in the water, but you know what? My hands still feel really oily. I need something else. What do you think I might need? If you were thinking you might need soap, kiss your brain. So here I've got some liquid soap, and I'm gonna rub that on. I'm gonna rub, and I'm gonna rub between my fingers and my thumb, and I'm gonna rub the backs of my hands, and I'm gonna rub between my fingers and the backs of my hands, and I'm gonna rub my thumbs again so they're nice and clean. And then I'm gonna turn my water on. Ah, the oil. The oil, let me get a paper towel here. The oil, oh, I got a little bit of oil on my computer. There we go. The oil washed right off when I used the soap, but it didn't wash off when I just used the water. That's why we need to use soap when we wash our hands, because it helps break apart oils and other germs, I guess, and other things on your hands, and works with the water to get your hands nice and clean. So you knew that because you use soap at school, right? All right, I'm going to see what happened to our little duck that's sitting here. Well, you know what? It did seem to absorb some of the oily paint, so I guess it didn't mind the paint because it had oil. So that was an experiment, and it turned out that it didn't make that much difference if I put oil on the duck first. So now I know. That's how we do experiments, right? Okay, so I'm going to set this aside. And I'm going to sing a song because, after all, it's Wacky Wednesday, and we don't have Debbie or Linda here in my house. So it's going to be me, but you know this song, and it's kind of a fun song. It's Five Little Ducks. So can you hold your 5 fingers up? 5 little ducks went out to play over the hills and far away. Mama duck said quack, quack, quack. 4 little ducks came running back. 4 little ducks went out to play over the hills and far away. Mama duck said quack, quack, quack. 3 little ducks came running back. 3 little ducks went out to play over the hills and far away. Mama duck said quack, quack, quack. 2 little ducks came running back. 2 little ducks went out to play over the hills and far away. Mama duck said quack, quack, quack. 1 little duck came running back. 1 little duck went out to play over the hills and far away. Mama duck said quack, quack, quack. 1 little duck came running back. No little ducks went out to play over the hills and far away. Mama duck said quack, quack, quack. 5 little ducks came running back. Okay, now I'm going to read. This is a classic book. It's been around a long, long time, and it's a great story. It's not about the pond at Lovelace Park where I saw my ducks. It's about a place in Boston, the city of Boston, that has a pond. And it is called Make Way for Ducklings by Robert McCloskey. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family when there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on and on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard, so down they flapped. Next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. So I saw when I was at Lovelace Park yesterday, I saw the ducks dip their heads under the water. I think they were looking for food too. Oh, this is cool. This is something they have at the public garden in Boston. It's called a swan boat. See, it has a swan on the end. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer. But the people on the boat threw peanuts into the water, so the mallards followed them all around the pond and got another breakfast, better than the first. So you have to be careful what you feed the ducks because you have to make sure it's something that's healthy for them. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in the pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But "Look out!" squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. "You'll get run over." And when she got her breath, she added, "This is no place for babies. With all those horrid things rushing about, we'll have to look somewhere else." What was rushing about? A kid on a bike. Oh my goodness, almost ran over the ducks. So they flew over Beacon Hill and around the State House, but there was no place there. They looked at Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. These are different places in the city of Boston. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mr. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. "That looks like just the right place to hatch ducklings." See the island? So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. All their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. But of course they could swim, and one day they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that the mallards called on Michael every day. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go to visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water or to have her lunch or to count the eggs and make sure they were all there. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All there. One day the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, and then Lack, then Mack, and Knack, and Quack, and Pack, and Quack. Wait. Whack and quack. Whack and quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. Oh, they're so cute. I didn't see any ducklings at Lovelace Park yet, but I think after the ducks build their nest, they'll lay some eggs, and then soon I'll see them. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. I'll meet you in a week in the public garden, he quacked over his shoulder. Take good care of the ducklings. Don't you worry, said Mrs. Mallard. I know all about bringing up children. And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. She taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. Good idea. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." Before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack fell into line, just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. There they waded ashore and waddled until they came to the highway. Uh-oh, how are they going to cross that highway, that street? Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk went the horns on the speeding cars. Quack went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, whack, or quack, 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 quack went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack. That's a little hard to say. Just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on, quack, quack, quacking. This says honk, honk, and this says quack, quack, and there's the little Mrs. Duck and the ducklings all in a dither. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistles. Tweet! There comes Michael. He's going to save the day, I think. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. He's saying, "Stop, stop." As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. What's he going to do from his police booth, I wonder? He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." Clancy said, "Family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned into Charles Street with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" And the man who swept the street said, "Well, now, ain't that nice?" And then Mrs. Mallard heard them. When Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud. She tipped her nose in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. There's Mrs. Duck. She looks so proud. She's proud of her babies. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the Ducks could march across the street. Can you see this? Let's see. I want to make sure you can see the ducks. See the ducks? They're the little ducks marching across the street. Okay. Right into the public garden. Inside the gate, they all turned round to say thank you to the policeman. The policeman smiled and waved goodbye. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there Mr. Mallard was waiting for them just as he had promised. There's Mr. Mallard on the island, and there they are swimming across. The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there all day long. They'd follow the swan boats and eat peanuts. Oh, I hope they don't get a tummy ache. I don't know if ducks should eat too many peanuts. And when night falls, they swam to their little island to go to sleep. The end. Isn't that a nice book? I love that book.